Hello. This presentation will cover the fundamentals of grant writing. The group members are listed on this slide and collectively have some unique experiences with grants. Some have participated in NIH, NEI-funded studies, others have written grants, and some work in grant administration offices. This proves there are many aspects to grants, and it takes multiple people with a variety of talents and expertise to effectively support grants at any institution. It should come to no surprise that grants are not easily acquired. Very few institutions receive large gifts unless they are already receiving large gifts from other donors. The majority of successful not-for-profits will receive most of its donations from individuals and corporations. A good goal is to aim for 15 to 25% of the total fundraising revenue from foundations. Grants come in many varieties, from single to multi-year grants, which may fund capital projects, growth initiatives, or general expenses. Even the way in which agencies distribute grant money varies widely. First, we need to understand foundations. A foundation is a nonprofit grant-making entity that exists for the purpose of giving money to other not-for-profit agencies. Money is given in the form of a grant with the purpose to help achieve goals related to the foundation's vision and mission. For example, the Illumination Foundation has a vision statement of breaking the cycle of homelessness. Their mission is to provide targeted interdisciplinary services for the most vulnerable homeless clients in order to break the cycle of homelessness. Another example is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has several divisions. Their U.S. program division has 3 arms that focus on helping children receive a quality secondary and post-secondary education. The majority of grants are focused on organizations and schools in the Pacific Northwest and range from helping implement kindergarten readiness programs and aligning instruction to the Common Core state standards to creating programs designed to help prepare students for college. Foundations operate with their own board of directors and staff that support their mission. Some, but not all foundations undertake their own fundraising efforts. This slide gives an overview of foundation operations. Foundations award grants based on their own priorities for the year dependent on their mission. They publish guidelines for grants that help the applicant determine if their priorities are aligned. The guidelines also contain application materials and deadlines. It is important to understand these guidelines, as some foundations will make rolling decisions throughout the year and others only allow applications during a window of time. Once the applications are received, the staff reviews and prioritizes the submissions. Some applicants may be contacted for additional information, while others may be disqualified outright. The top-ranked applicants are sent to a committee of board members where they determine the recipients. Grant recipients must file regular reports to the foundation for accountability. The most effective universities will have a fundraising plan that incorporates foundation fundraising. Support staff will need to find appropriate foundations and write grants with enough dedicated time and support to meet the institution's foundation fundraising goal. The most crucial function is to ensure the mission of the institution matches the mission of the foundation. There are 2 aspects to the solicitation process: grant prospecting and grant writing. Grant prospecting is the time spent prior to writing a grant where the staff person is determining which foundations are appropriate for the institution to submit grant applications. We found a great article we'd highly recommend from the website The Fundraising Authority called A Guide to Raising Money from Foundations. In this article, the author outlines 5 steps for successful grant prospecting. It starts with reviewing your mission and program to determine if your priorities fit with the foundation's priorities. From here, you create a master list of foundations that align with your mission. There are a number of websites you can review to find foundations and their mission statements. Even if you believe your institution's mission aligns with the foundation's mission, it is important to review the foundation's guidelines to determine if your institution even qualifies. From here, you should create a grant schedule that lists out all the eligible foundations, contact information, guidelines, ranges, dates, and materials. From this master list, you can create a strategic plan for applying. Your strategic plan should include a cost versus benefit analysis. Now the grant writing begins. The same article mentioned on the previous slide also lists the 5 steps for writing grants. Since you have prepared, you will know the rules for applying and have all the necessary materials you will need for the application, including budgets and program descriptions. When writing, be sure you keep your writing style simple. Keep in mind the reader and their lack of familiarity with your organization. Also keep it succinct. Remember, the staff reads hundreds of proposals. Edit your application multiple times. There should be no typographical or grammatical errors. The more careless errors, the harder it is for the reader to take your application serious. Once submitted, be patient. Be sure to follow their follow-up rules. While you are waiting, you can start writing your next grant application.
Before we get into too much detail, let's review the common components of grant writing. So a proposal is what you are submitting to a grant funding source in order to be considered to receive a grant. So proposal definition is a formal proposal submitted to a government or organization funding source that outlines a project and demonstrates budgetary requirements and requests funding assistance in the form of a grant. The hexagon tool is something that you can use prior to diving into the writing process. This will help you brainstorm about different ideas and identify different resources that you may need while you're getting into the grant writing process. And we will also review the writing process itself and review everything from beginning, middle to end. So the hexagon tool is comprised of 6 different components. The first step in this process is need. So when you're identifying the need of your project, you're really looking for any significant academic or social issues that your institution is dealing with. And then for fit, this is looking into any current initiatives that the institution may have. Is it reflective of the mission and vision of the institution or what has been adopted in the strategic plan? And then your resources, when you're looking into resources, you're looking for tools that are going to help you get the job done. So this could include anything along the lines of curriculum, office or classroom space, staffing, information technology, data systems, anything along those lines. For evidence, this is helping you to weigh the outcomes of your project. So you're really going to want to look into cost effectiveness and efficiency. Have there been any other studies or any other projects that have done that are similar to yours, and how will yours be different? Is it going to help your students out? In what way do you know that? So that's what you're looking for when you're identifying evidence for your project. And then for readiness for implementation, you're really looking into if this project can be repeated. So could you roll out this project the following year with an entirely new set of students? And do you have professionals available right away that will be able to work once funding starts? And for capacity, you're looking in the ability for the project to be implemented right away once funding hits. So you're going to want to make sure that the staff that you have on hand meets the minimum qualifications, or are you going to have to hire people? You're also going to be looking into sustainability as well. So again, can this project be repeated in the following years? And even after funding ends, will you be able to still have this project at your institution in order to help out students, or is it contingent upon receiving grant funding? Let's go ahead and start talking about the grant writing process now. So before you really dive into the bulk of the work here with the writing, there are some things that you need to do before you begin that process. The first step that you're going to want to take is to read the request for proposals, or RFPs for short. So when you're reading an RFP, it's going to set out some guidelines that are involved with this grant. So you're going to want to look into the different types of funding that are available. Is it a matching grant, or is it a grant where they're going to supply 100% of the funding for your project? You'll also want to look into the formatting guide for when you're writing your grant proposal. And you're also going to want to review the submission timeline. So make sure that you have deadlines set out for yourself. That way you're not trying to scramble at the last minute to get your proposal in. And the next step that you're going to want to do is organize your proposal so that it will fit the parameters of your RFP. So it's very important that you meet all of those guidelines. If you're uncertain about any part of it, you're really going to want to make sure that you reach out to whoever is managing the grant writing process for this funding, and ask some questions. Make sure that you're meeting every single guideline that they have set out for grantees. And then when you're getting ready to write, you're going to want to start brainstorming your writing process. So planning with the big picture in mind is always the best way to go. So this is going to help you outline all of the smaller details along the way. You're going to want to think about your short-term and your long-term goals that you wish to achieve. So when you're thinking of the writing process, you're really going to want to look into what do you hope to achieve 1 year from now, or 5 years from now, or even 10 years from now with this project. So for the grant writing process, there are 6 different components that are going to make up your entire proposal here. So the first one is your credibility statement. This is going to explain who you are and why you are exceptional. So you don't have to be a big name in the field in order to list reasons why you're exceptional, but these organizations are looking to fund you. So it's very important that you build a case for yourself and name some things that your institution does really well. With your second step for the problem statement, you're going to want to make sure that you identify any measurable problems or needs that are being focused on. And the key word here is measurable. So it's very important that you identify your assessment tool that you're going to be using when you're tracking the data that you collect for your program. When you're looking into your problem statement as well, you're going to want to make sure that you use data that you've collected up to this point that will support your problem statement, that builds a logical case for you as far as why you're trying to put a proposal out there to gain funding in order to meet these issues that your institution is experiencing. It's also very important that you're being creative and innovative when you're emphasizing what you're trying to achieve. Then the third step with your measurable objectives, you're really going to want to demonstrate the essence of the work that you will be doing here. So breaking down every goal that you have listed out in your proposal and how that's going to be measured. And you're really going to want to indicate how you know that you will accomplish that goal. So it's very important that you set out some baseline data for your measurable objectives. And when you're talking about your objectives, this is where you're going to be discussing the who, what, when, where, and why of your program. And for your methodology for the fourth step, this is where you're going to be outlining the operational side of your proposal. This is going to outline how you will impact the students that you are going to be serving with this project. This will probably be the lengthiest portion of your proposal, so you're really going to want to outline this well and have all of your ideas organized. That way you meet every goal that you're trying to achieve. So when you're demonstrating the details of each and every step, you're going to want to make sure that it also logically flows into the next step that you're outlining. And when you're looking into methodology as well, you're really going to want to make sure that you're being descriptive here. More often than not, this is where proposals will be turned down in the grant writing process for funding. So make sure that you're being descriptive and you have your ideas organized. And then for your evaluation plan, you're going to outline how you will assess the impact of your methodology. So this usually is going to outline a specific plan that you will be using later on. So make sure that you put some thought into this portion of the grant writing process. So down the road, if you receive funding, your evaluation plan is going to be critical in helping you to contribute on your end what information you need to put into a memorandum of understanding with the funding source. That way you guys have some guidelines set out in the future as far as rules and policies go on how you're going to operate. And then the last step is the budget. So with your budget, this one's pretty straightforward. You're just going to be outlining how you're going to be spending the money for your project. So with this portion of the writing process, you're really going to want to make sure that your business office or your grant management office is heavily involved in the writing phases of this. So when you're looking into your budget, make sure that you're pointing out how it relates to your methodology. You don't want any surprises coming up as far as budgeting goes. You're going to want to make sure that you're not going to run out of funding at any point in time. So make sure that you have each of your steps in your methodology lined out perfectly. That way it transitions into your budget pretty seamlessly. And there's going to be two parts for your budget, the budget form and the narrative. So the budget form is just going to list out categories, and the narrative is going to point out how you arrived at the figures that you are suggesting for your proposal. So you're really going to want to make sure that you're building a case for yourself again as far as when you're requesting this funding. So after you wrap up the writing process of your grant proposal, you just have a few steps left before you submit your proposal to the funding source. So first, you're going to want to read and review your proposal multiple times. You're really going to want to make sure that every person that was involved in the writing process, or if they will be involved with the project later on down the road when it's operational, make sure that they read and review the proposal as well. You're also going to want to check for grammar and errors, check for formatting guidelines. Did you meet every topic that they had set out in the RFP? And after you've done that, make sure that you review the guidelines for submission. So sometimes there are some specific guidelines for this. Occasionally you might have to submit your proposal through a secure site. So is there login information that you need to know about in order to submit your proposal? Or is it something as simple as emailing it to somebody at the funding source? So you're going to want to review that as well. But once you submit, you will be well on your way to receiving funding for your project.
And now I'm going to talk a little bit about identifying a grant. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is figure out what type of funding it is that you're going to be searching for. There are generally two types of funding. That's private grants and public grants. Private grants, as the name denotes, the funding is coming from a private source such as a foundation or a private entity, where public grants are funded by either our federal government or state government. There are multiple ways that you can look into finding grants, both from public and private sources. Of course, the first one is just figuring out exactly what it is that you're wanting to get funded and using a regular search engine to find a grant based on your needs, whether it be medical or service, etc. There are also some really interesting tools that you can use, such as grant search engines. I've given 2 examples here, both for private grants and for public grants. Those include things like the Foundation Center or grants.org. As you can see in the sidebar, I have a picture of our search engine from grants.org. So you can do a multitude of things, either using keywords, searching specific from an opportunity number if you had that, or you can kind of narrow down exactly what it is that you're looking for by locale or category. And one of the questions that you may be thinking about right now is really, what is the difference? So some of the advantages of receiving private funding is that there could be a more rapid turnaround, as private organizations have set schedules, and there may be fewer levels of review and approval that need to move forward with. There are also possibly fewer regulations than for federal awards. And there can also be fewer applicants in the pool. So those are some great advantages. As far as disadvantages, you're looking at awards possibly being smaller and not having as large of a pool of money. The areas of focus may rapidly change or be very strict depending on what it is that that private entity is wanting to fund. On the other hand, with federal funding, like I said, there may be more funding available to apply for in more different areas or categories that you could apply for. And there are usually common application forms that make the process a little bit easier for you. Something that you need to keep in mind is that when you are soliciting for a grant, there are some different laws and policies that you're going to have to think about, including understanding your own university's policies on soliciting. It's also really important to think of the tax responsibility when you're soliciting for grant funding. In many states, they look at grant funding as a charitable solicitation, and you actually need to be registered in order to be able to solicit that funding. It was actually 41 states that you would need to do that, so it's very likely that you are living in a state that requires that. And many grants require that you have tax-exempt status or a 501c3 before they will award you any funding, and that is just because they can end up paying a larger amount on the grant since it is considered a charitable donation. Additionally, you're going to want to look at deadlines. It's one of 2 really primary areas that you're going to want to focus on when you're looking at grants. Requirements is the next one, and we'll look at that next. There really is no standard deadline. It's not like February 1st, all grant funding becomes available, but many of our grants work on what's called a cycle, which means the year is broken down into 1, 2, 3, or 4 cycles that you would be applying for, and so grants would open during a certain period and then close during a certain period. However, I highly recommend that you check the general information for on any grant that you're applying for, and also checking individual websites for deadlines. I've provided an example here below. This is a screenshot of some general information for a grant that was posted on grants.gov. And as you can see in the red box, there is the current closing date or the deadline to apply for that grant. And it's specifically stating that by December 4th of 2017 at 11:59 p.m., grants must be submitted or they will be ineligible for consideration. And lastly, you want to make sure that you are looking at the requirements or eligibility sections of the grants. When you're identifying the grant, one of the first things you're going to need to know is whether you're actually eligible and fit the requirements of the grant. So as you can see here, I have also pulled a screenshot from an eligibility section. This is actually the same grant from the example we just saw before. And it's specifically stating here that to be eligible, you need to be a nonprofit having a 501c3 status, as we talked about under the soliciting grant section. And then one other thing that you need to think about is looking at the additional information section, which is usually under eligibility. In almost every example I looked up, it was just below, and sometimes they will have additional requirements that you need to meet, kind of similar to minimum requirements and desired requirements. The eligibility is the minimum requirements, and then there are also desired requirements for many of the grants that were listed on the two websites that I was talking about. So it's really important to make sure that you're looking into that and that you fit all of the requirements, that you've hit the deadlines for when they are due, and that you are identifying the source of funding as you are looking and applying for your grants.
I'm going to talk about grant management. Managing the grant will depend on the type of grant that is received by the institution, but most grants will likely have the same components such as internal control, reports, etc. The entity from which a grant is received will have specifics on how to manage the grant, and also some grants can be very small while other grants are very large, like federal grants, for example, TRIO. The following are likely to be in a grant: a narrative or scope of work, which is usually part of the grant writing process, but it's also one that will continue to be part of the grant, and that is where the institution will tell the what it's going to be doing with the money. And then the funds will always have to be spent for those specific objectives that are in the narrative. There's a budget, which is also part of the grant writing process, and if approved, it will be the same once the grant funds are awarded. And they are very unique into which type of grant they are. Like some grants like TRIO, which are very large, will have very specific budgets with many line items that will include not only salaries, but facilities, office expenses, travel budgets, etc. And some other grants can be small and just simply be for $1,500 to implement a project or for a conference, for example, and those will not be as specific. It could maybe just include materials and time. It also has a list of deliverables and submittals. The deliverables will be related to when part of the grant is expected to be received, and the submittal is just how the institution conveys the information for that particular deliverable. There are usually very specific forms in the grants that can be annexed to the grant as appendixes, and that will include budget funds request or travel funds, etc. And there are financial reports, which will depend also on the type of grant. Some are very specific, but I will talk about that more in the next slide. The internal controls, like every institution, will have specific internal controls. Some grants that are received for implementing programs like TRIO, for example, will have their own specific office where the controls are put together. But as we have learned from the past, we need a couple of sets of eyes to make sure that the grant funds are utilized as they are expected to be. Reports will include monthly or quarterly, bi-monthly or yearly reports, depending on the grant. Those are very specific to the type of grant. But that's most likely to have financial reports as well as narrative reports, which will specify how each of the budget items have been spent. And those reports are very similar to accounting reports. They're usually income and expense reports, balance sheets, time reports as well, depending on the grant. Other controls include that every receipt has to be kept, and only the money can only be used for specific grant budget items, and that has to be very strict. And also, there's specific forms for traveling if the grant includes travel time, which are usually follow the GSA guidelines, the governmental guidelines. There is also invoices that can be used to solicit money, as well as making payments to vendors that are specified on the grant, etc. Also, the grant will specify what activities and tasks can be created with the grant. They specify what type of expenses can be incurred and what is exactly a grant directed expense. Other grants will only transfer the funds to the program after each solicitation, so each time they need to spend the money, they will need to solicit it, while others will give the money to the foundation, while other grants, the money is kept by the federal agent or the state agent and will be disbursed each year or each time that is required as per the grant proposal. The information regarding how the grant is implemented is usually public and it's required to be presented to the public, especially for federal grants. And that is done either by printing out, by posting the financial reports on the website of the institution, as well as public records that can be easily searched through the government. The financial information is usually audited also before it's published, and that's normally done by an external CPA firm. And lastly, the grant report, the final one, will be required to specify whether the program has been implemented successfully. Some grants are lost because the programs don't take off, which is very rare in institutions, as well as sometimes the grants will expire after a certain number of years and not be renewed. And that's why it's very important that all the grant funds are expended before the end of the grant. Thank you.
The budget is the chief support or backbone of the grant proposal. Program activities will be the driving factor in creating a budget, and the program narrative should match the budget perfectly. There should be no surprises. Cost estimates should be credible and realistic, as inflated budgets will damage credibility with the grant reviewer, and all costs should be itemized. Never use the word miscellaneous. And if there are any unusually large expenses or unclear items, include a budget narrative explaining the details and calculations used. Most foundations like to see two types of budgets in a grant proposal: the operating budget and the project or program budget. The operating budget is the financial statement of the organization submitted annually and is a projection of the income and expenses for the organization's fiscal year. This can also be known as the organization budget. The second type of budget is the project or program budget. This is the budget that will dictate the resources required to ensure success of the proposed project or program. While budgets can be presented in different formats, two elements should always be included: the time period for which the project will last, and expenses categorized into personnel and non-personnel. This budget can also include support that will be received, such as institutional match funds or revenue expected to be earned. Using the steadfast approach to building a grant budget will ensure the organization meets the stated goals and objectives of the proposed program or project. S. Spending schedule. Does the budget depict a monthly timeline for spending grant funds? T. Task oriented. Is every line item in the budget discussed in the narrative, and are they consistent with the narrative? E. Evaluative. Are all costs assigned to objectives and activities? Do the costs add up to the total grant amount? A. Accurate. Do all figures and calculations total correctly across forms, budget, and narratives? Does income equal expenses? D. Dependable. Can the organization achieve the proposed objectives with the grant funds? How will the project be adjusted if approved for less? F. Flexible. Can the budget accommodate unforeseen circumstances? Have variable and fixed costs been identified? A. Allocated resources. Are there budget restrictions or limitations? Are all costs allowable? S. Sustainable. Are we optimizing resources? How might the project and budget change at the end of the grant period? Who are potential funding sources to support future activities? T. Team-oriented. Are we including appropriate staff members on the team to develop the budget? How often should the team meet to review the project and the budget? Overall, when creating a grant budget, it is important to think of everything you could possibly need, while being careful to only include items that are necessary and reasonable. Try not to overestimate or underestimate. Both will be bad in the long term.
As you prepare your grant proposal, it is important to recognize that there are many internal controls, procedures, and departments you will be working with. Next, we will give you an overview of these departments and how you will interact with them. First, the Office of Sponsored Projects, or on some campuses, Office of Sponsored Programs, is the main liaison for many campuses in submitting and managing grants. This department may go by other names at different institutions, but their goals and roles are similar. The Office of Sponsored Projects, or OSP, is responsible for negotiating the F&A, Facilities and Administration rate, for the institution. F&A is a percentage of the grant award the institution keeps in order to cover the administrative costs of managing the grant. This supports the OSP itself, as well as the Financial Services Office, maintenance, IT, and other institutional costs associated for the grant. OSP also supports the grant application process by helping grant writers and PIs review their grants and make sure all required components are complete. They help maintain timelines for submitting grants by their deadlines and do the actual submission of the proposal to the grant portal. OSP plays a key part in grant submission and management processes, and it is essential to understand their regulations and procedures before you begin your grant writing process so that their application goes smoothly. Here is an example from the University of New Mexico detailing the purpose, mission, and vision of their Office of Sponsored Projects. Notice they include where they fit in the reporting structure of the university, under the direction of the Office of the Vice President for Research and the Financial Services Division. They also include that their purpose is to provide administration, management, and oversight of outside sponsored research. Whether or not your grant includes a research component, all proposals are handled through OSP. Other important aspects of OSP include compliance, staff and faculty support, and this is an important example of how internal controls at work that both ensure compliance with regulations and fiscal responsibility. At Colorado State, OSP even helps identify funding opportunities and works with the legal aspects of non-disclosure. Their different institutional structure is reflected here as well. Instead of using a centralized financial services office, CSU OSP has their own financial management that deals with the financial reporting and even invoicing. This is an important reminder that each institution implements a different structure and assigns roles and responsibilities differently. It is important to research your own institution structure so that you understand how operations will proceed. Each institution has an authorized organizational representative, or AOR. The actual working title of this person may vary from campus to campus. The AOR is the designated individual who does the final submission of the grant for the institution. They have their own login, for example, at grants.gov, and special access to complete the submission process. Typically, this person will work in the OSP, but again, this may vary by institution and the type of grant that is being submitted. Health sciences or medical-related grants, for example, often are submitted via an AOR in a parallel structure from that College of Medicine or medical center if the institution has one. This person will work with the PI to ensure grant submission and review the proposal, but they will not write the proposal for the PI. Who or what is a PI? The principal investigator, or PI, is the key individual on any grant. The PI is often the grant writer, but not always. In the case where the grant writer does not want PI responsibility or is not permitted by the institution to be a PI. The PI is the person ultimately responsible for all grant activities, research, reporting, purchases, and accountability related to the grant. Often, there are additional staff that support the PI, such as a project manager or other roles, depending on the size and structure of the grant. Institutions also determine who can or cannot be a PI. At the University of New Mexico, only faculty and staff at a certain grade or employment level or job category can be a PI. These regulations keep the university in compliance with federal regulations that the individuals are qualified to conduct research or other educational projects. UNM also requires grant management training for PIs that is renewed every 3 years. Colorado State has more detailed descriptions about who can be a PI and who can't. Non-temporary, salaried, state classified, or general faculty employees. They also have a process whereby other classifications may be co-PIs with approval from their departments. It is important to know your institution's requirements, restrictions, and training that is necessary for a PI before embarking on your grant submission process. Often, staff are able to work in concert with a faculty or administrative PI to obtain and implement a grant project. F&A, Facilities and Administration rate, and fringe rate are important parts of your grant budget as detailed earlier. The OSP typically posts these rates on their website and is responsible for negotiating these rates for the institution. Fringe are the benefits associated with employment, such as medical and unemployment insurance and workman's comp, for which employers pay a significant portion. If your grant includes salaries, calculating for fringe will be important since they are a significant expense. Some grants specify that they do not cover fringe, and that would have to be paid for by the institution. Dartmouth has a very clear and comprehensive definition of F&A rates. Facilities and administrative costs, F&A costs, are those that are incurred for common or joint objectives and therefore cannot be identified readily and specifically with a particular sponsored project and institutional activity or any other institutional activity. F&A costs are broad categories of costs. Facilities is defined as depreciation and use allowances, interest on debt associated with certain buildings, equipment and capital improvements, operation and maintenance expenses, and library expenses. Administration is defined as general administration and general expenses, departmental administration, sponsored projects administration, student administration and services, and all other types of expenditures not listed specifically under one of the subcategories of facilities. Before you begin writing your grant, be sure that you fully understand your institution's policies and procedures. Reach out to your OSP and senior faculty and administrators to find out more and gather information from their experiences. Know the steps. Who can be a PI and what departmental approvals will be required for your grant proposal before it goes to OSP. Know the internal deadlines. For example, OSP may require your proposal for review 10 business days before the grant submission is deadline. Your department may want it 10 days before that, and you may need time for revisions. Know the F&A rate, or at least where to find it. This is essential for building your budget correctly, and F&A rates can change annually. If your institution has a budget template, you will have to use their form for budget section of your proposal. Find out what additional pre-submission paperwork you may need to submit, such as a PI approval form, disclosure forms, and so forth. These will all be on their departmental website. Your institutional data, including your DUNS number, will also be necessary for submitting your proposal. Your OSP will be able to help you through this process. Some types of grants have additional requirements and procedures. Any grant with human subjects will also fall under the oversight of the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. The IRB has specific protocols and procedures, even for things like student surveys or focus groups that will require prior approval. Often, participants will have to sign permission forms and receive a copy of their rights and information about what information is being collected about them and how it will be used. This is governed by federal regulations. After the grant is awarded, there are many steps in OSP for getting the funds received and earmarked for the grant activities. Having an understanding of this process before your award comes will help make the process go more quickly and avoid some of the last-minute stress. It is also important to understand how purchasing and salaries, if applicable, will be handled for your grant. There are typically several layers of internal controls, such as purchase orders reviewed at 3 levels, compliance assurance processes that regulate what is allowable under the grant. And again, each institution's process will vary, so spending some time doing research will be helpful.